So let's talk about snapshots, right? Because this is probably the easiest thing, easiest backup type. There are two types of snapshots that I will be talking about. One is CSI and the other, what I call the provider snapshots. CSI, for those of you who are not familiar with it, CSI is container storage interface. That is the storage standard adopted on Kubernetes. It's very widely adopted now, and we can see that from all our customer interactions and everywhere based on the questions. Most of the persistent volumes these days are CSI persistent volumes, and that's a good thing. It's an accepted standard. The standard is evolving very fast. More and more operations are being added to, more and more interfaces are being added to this CSI spec. So it's a good thing that a lot of people are moving to it, right, or already moved to it. But unfortunately, there are still some gotchas that you need to be aware of, and I will be talking about that, right? And CSI spec supports the snapshot API, and for the CSI PVs, that's what I mean by CSI snapshots. Velero will be using those APIs to take the snapshot. The second type of what I call the provider snapshots, for the lack of better term, this is if you're not using CSI. For example, if your cluster is running in EKS and if you're using the EBS driver, right? To take the snapshot, you have to use the EBS APIs. And obviously, for that, you need code specific to the EBS. And that is done through the Velero plugins. So you need Velero AWS plugin, volume snapshotter plugin to take the snapshot. So I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on this because, like I said, majority of people these days are only using CSI. So let's get into more detail about the CSI snapshot. So what is involved here? So first of all, CSI installation is not a straightforward process. Unfortunately, it's not included in your vanilla Kubernetes installation. I mean, you probably are like you're in luck if your clusters are running in cloud providers like EKS, Google, or Azure, because they in most cases when you create the cluster, you're going to have this option CSI add-on, right? Something like that. So you just select that, and you're going to have the CSI installation done on your cluster. Nothing else needs to be done. But if that's not the case, if your clusters are running on-prem or if you're using providers which don't support this kind of add-on functionality, you really need to jump through some hoops to get the CSI up and working, right? That means you have to install the proper CSI driver. And not only that, there is a component called external snapshotter. So that is a platform component that is required for the CSI to work, but it's not included in vanilla Kubernetes, right? And the most important thing here is that you need to find the right version of the external snapshotter that works, that is compatible with the CSI driver. So we see this, again, people run into problems because either they forget to install the external snapshotter or they use the wrong version. So snapshots don't work. So we see this all the time from our customers as well as from Velero users. Now, to enable the Velero CSI functionality, when you install Velero, so you need to do two things. First of all, you need to pass this option, enable CSI, and also you need to include the CSI plugin, right? So I'll quickly go through my own Velero install command here. So I'm going to show here. So I have this enable CSI flag. And as you can see, I also included the Velero CSI plugin, right? One important point here to note is the version of the plugin. I mean, this applies to all the plugins, not just the CSI plugin. This is another area where people run into trouble because they do not use the right version of the plugin. So if you're using 1.12, you must use this CSI plugin, right? 0.6.0 at this point. And if you're using 1.11, at this moment, 0.51 CSI plugin is the latest version. So if you don't do that, Velero will not comply. The installation will be successful, but when you really do the backup, you will see mysterious errors. And it's always very difficult to debug at that point, right? So you have to make sure that you are using the right plugin versions when you install the CSI. All right. So there are more things that you need to do to get the CSI snapshots to work. One is you need to have the volume snapshot class, because when you create to create the PV snapshot, the way to do that is Velero creates a volume snapshot resource. That is the way to create a resource. And the external snapshotter is going to see this and then start the snapshot process, right? But even before that happens, you need to have the volume snapshot class for each CSI driver on your cluster. And not only that, you need to set this label on that volume snapshot class. For example, here I have, I'll show you that. So on my cluster, I have a single volume snapshot class. Again, this is the DigitalOcean cluster. And now you can see the label that I set on this, right? So you have to set this label. This is how Velero knows which volume snapshot class to use. Again, in 1.12, new features are introduced in this area. If you want a more advanced ways of specifying volume snapshot class, you can do. But for most purposes, you will probably have one volume snapshot class per CSI driver. So it's enough if you put this label on that volume snapshot class. Now, as I mentioned, if the CSI is not properly configured, you're going to see errors in Velero log saying, Velero basically times out after 10 minutes. It creates a snapshot request. It waits for 10 minutes, and if snapshot is not ready, it moves on. And most probable reason for that is some problem with the external snapshotter. Either the version or the external snapshotter is not there itself, right? Okay, so before we go to provided snapshots, I do have a CSI backup done. So I'll show again details here, backup details. And I want to point out especially one thing here. So if you do the backup describe details on a CSI backup, you're going to see an entry like this, CSI volume snapshots. In my case, I have one persistent volume. So you're actually seeing one PV here. So if you have multiple, you're going to see all of them here, right? This is the snapshot details. So let's just quickly talk about provider snapshots and jump to the other backup types. And if you're not using CSI PVs, right? For example, EBS, you have to use this provider snapshots. And for that, you have to include the right plugin, AWS plugin, for example, in this case. And then Velero will use that plugin to create the snapshot. The plugin itself is going to use that storage specific or provider specific APIs, right? To take the snapshot. It works very similar. Once the snapshot is taken, it's very similar to how CSS snapshots behave for all the other purposes, rest of the functionality. But again, we won't cover much about this. Now, there are some limitations that you should be aware of, right? Snapshots, you probably heard this, multiple people say this, right? Snapshots are not backups. I mean, they're good for certain things. You can keep few snapshots around for doing quick restores. Maybe you keep last 7 days or so if you want to really do a quick restore. But snapshots cannot be your full backup strategy. Now, why? Because snapshots are typically tied to your primary storage. And if something happens with your primary storage, not only you're going to lose that, you're also going to lose the snapshots. And that is bad, because this is precisely the time that you need your backups, when you lose your primary storage, right? And even if the snapshots are not very closely tied to the primary storage, for example, if you snapshot EBS volumes in EKS, it will move the data to S3, right? EBS snapshots are persisted in S3, but even then there are a lot of limitations. For example, those EBS snapshots are tied to the region that the cluster is in. If the cluster is in US East 1, you cannot restore those snapshot backups into another region. And you definitely need that for disaster recovery, right? So for all these reasons, snapshots should not be your only backup strategy. They can be part of your backup strategy, but you should have other backups like file system backups and other backups as part of your strategy. That's very, very important.